Hello and welcome to episode 257 of the Paint All the Minis podcast. We put the show together so you can have something to listen to whilst you are getting up to whatever it is that you are being up to. Our aim is to have a relaxed and genuine conversation with someone who's as involved in our hobby as you are, from any level, top to bottom, because we all have our own unique and individual stories, and it's interesting listening to them. And if you don't find that interesting, probably not the podcast for you, but that's okay. So sit at your hobby desk, paint your models, listen to the chat. We really do hope that you enjoy the content. This week I talked to Mr. Stephen Baker, the world-renowned game designer. Stephen's work includes, but is not limited to, Heroquest, Battle Masters, and Space Crusade. This is the first of some podcasts that I'm going to do with Stephen, and I really wanted to take the time to get to know him and really discuss the things that popped up in the conversation, as opposed to kind of rushing through and him just feeling like we were superficially pumping him from information and asking clickbaity questions and getting answers to probably things that he's been asked 100,000 times previously. So this show is very much one of getting to know him, his hobby history, and any other interesting tidbits that popped up along the way as we chatted. And we end this show ready to discuss Heroquest and its genesis and his creation of games as a games designer. So if you're listening to this show hoping just specifically to hear questions and answers to do with Heroquest, might not really be the best one for you. But what I will say is that all of the things that we talk about in this show are probably pertinent because Heroquest grew out of his experience and his, experiences as a kid and his formative steps within the games industry and things like that. So I hope you really enjoy it in and of itself as an episode. I've chatted to a lot of people now, and I've been really fortunate to have done so. But Stephen really does stand out as somebody who commanded my rapt attention by his sheer depth of his insight. You can tell that he's not some sort of Johnny-come-lately who's trying to blag everybody with bluster. I find myself during the conversation to be truly immersed, and I really do hope that comes across in the chat. Many thanks to Stephen for coming onto the show. Round 2 is already booked in, and Heroquest is going to, and his early work, Heroquest and his early work is going to form the main basis of that chat. So if there's anything specific, any specific areas or questions that you might have that you might like to put forward, then please let me know so I can potentially factor that into our next chat. Don't forget, you can also check out the previous show catalogue that we've got at this point, 256 plus episodes. So if you're new to the podcast through listening to this episode, take some time to go back and check out previous shows. Not just people that you see and you've heard of, the Rick Priestley or the Andy Chambers or the anything else. Take some time to maybe just listen to somebody you've never heard of before. Just a regular hobby nerd like us, or somebody who's maybe involved in the video game industry, or maybe a sculptor, because as I mentioned at the very top of the introduction, that we've all got our own unique and individual stories, and the best shows for me have always been the ones that maybe I've not been expecting. All of them are interesting in their own right, but the best ones are ones that maybe you just didn't expect. And so please take some time to look at that back catalogue because there's a lot of value. There's a lot of value in there. There's a lot of hours of listeningage that you can get amongst. If you want to come and hang out with chilled out and relaxed, like-minded hobby people with no advertisements being shoved down your throat, where it's just a feed of your friends or potential friends that are doing stuff that you are interested in, you can click on the link to our Paint All the Minis Discord. That is in the podcast description. If you've got any questions for our next show with Stephen or anything else that you would like to contribute, you can email me, paintalltheminis@gmail.com. You can come and join the Facebook group. You can check us out on Blue Sky. And don't forget to share the show and interact with us. That's what it's all about. This is a little gift that you can send to somebody. If you spotted the show and you think somebody else that might be interested in it, share it. They'll like it. It costs you nothing. And yet somebody might enjoy some some shared conversations with you. You might be able to lift share or carpool. You might be able to have a little bit of a chat about the things that came up in this episode with Stephen if you both listen to the show. That is enough of the pre-ramble ramble. I ain't got anything else. If you are so inclined or you forget to press stop at the end of the conversation, you can check out the post-ramble ramble. But anyway, that's enough of the pre-ramble ramble. Let's go!
Paint all the minis that you can. And when you paint your minis, listen to that podcast with Dan Adams, that is.
Do you smell that? Do you smell that? Dull coat, son. Nothing else in the world smells like that. I love the smell of dull coat in the morning. You know, one time we varnished a whole army for 12 hours. When it was all over, I walked up. We didn't find one of them. Not one stinking unpainted mini. The smell, you know, that varnish smell? The whole army smelled like victory.
I'm here with Mr. Stephen Baker. How's it going, Stephen?
It's great, thanks, Dan. Thanks for inviting me on.
Nice. Baker. Are you a baker? Do you like cooking at home?
You know what? I always joke that my wife married me because of my second name. She loves baking. Nice. She's always cranking out the cupcakes and what have you. I'm more of a savory man. I'm more of in the meat and potatoes rather than the cake.
Yeah, just change your name, Stephen Cook, then, and she can change her name Baker. There you go. That's cool. So yeah, she had an instant positive association with you because of your second name. That was it. That was the clincher. So you're an Englishman. Whereabouts are you from originally in England?
So I was originally from the sort of Twickenham area, nice. West London, around close to Richmond. For those who you don't know where Twickenham is, not far from the rugby ground. Actually, we lived about a mile, just a little over a mile from the rugby ground. So on a good day when there was an international match, you could hear the cheering. And pretty much spent most of my life in the sort of Twickenham, Richmond area until I was in my sort of early 30s when I moved down to Swindon.
Right. Intentionally, you want to move to Swindon? Did you kind of get the atlas out and open it all up and you're like, Fiji, no, Paris, no, Swindon?
It was basically, it was just part of my journey. When I first started work, I was working in a bank coming out of school. From working in a bank, I, through a sort of happen chance, ended up working at Games Workshop at their sort of Dowling Road store in Hammersmith, and from there, through again other happen chance, I ended up working at Milton Bradley. I left Milton Bradley in '92, did my own thing for a couple of years, and then needed to get back into a full-time job, and happened to have the opportunity to go and work for Bluebird Toys, who were based in Swindon. Okay. So it was Swindon was, at the end of a number of sort of career sort of changes that I had in my my early mid-20s.
So what's Swindon got going for it? Because I guess a lot of people go and visit London for Big Ben, maybe Oxford, maybe Cambridge, these areas. But why should people be going to Swindon?
Swindon, it's kind of funny. I don't know that Swindon. I look back fondly at my time in Swindon. I enjoyed living there, and primarily because it was a sort of a fairly small town, and I lived in a street that was kind of around 400 yards away from like a little main street that had some little sort of cafes in a good a good bar. So it was kind of like easy to just get up in the morning, wander around the corner and have a sort of a choice of where to go get breakfast, or in the evening go get a drink. It's a college town, or at least has that sort of vibe. So, when I was in my 30s, it was kind of a fun place to be. Yeah. But I don't know that there's any specific thing in Swindon that you would go there for, other than it's really well situated if you want to sort of, swing into, the West Country, or you want to get up into, Wiltshire and stuff like that.
Nice. Well, then you took the decision to move and go across the pond. So where did he land across the pond? Why did he go there? And what do you like about there?
So when I was working for Bluebird, I worked there for probably 4 or 5 years. And at the end, Bluebird were basically bought out by Mattel. So there was a competitive, or a sort of, an aggressive takeover attempt. And, long story short, through a lot of, various options, Mattel decided to buy Bluebird, primarily because they wanted to safeguard the Polly Pocket product line, which they distributed internationally. So, I basically found myself without a job and looked at various options. Mattel offered me a position to go work in their games team in El Segundo on the West Coast. But as it happened, Hasbro were also looking to ramp up their games team, and they also offered me a job on the East Coast. And, I like the passage of the seasons. I'm more of an autumn winter man than, forever son of California.
Yeah.
Plus, Hasbro had a deeper portfolio of games, and it was going back to work with brands that I knew well. So moved here in 2000, and that was, 25 years ago.
Nice. Jeepers. So what do you like about living in the States compared to the UK?
So it's fascinating because it really sort of changes. My first couple of years here, and I guess I'm sure that you've experienced the same, living abroad yourself, is that in the first couple of years, you're trying to kind of maintain certain contacts with, friends and family back home. There are weddings, there are big occasions, and you fly back. And in the first few years, you're more mindful of, the pub culture here isn't the same as the pub culture in the US, in the UK. And, I'm not a big sports person, but I enjoy watching my rugby, and there's no, rugby here per se. But to be honest, it's like 25 years later, I'm not sure I even remember what it was like to live in the UK. And even if I do, having been back there, a few times recently to see my parents and my family, it just seems like it's changed a lot. And, so it's funny, but you never quite lose touch with the fact that I'm not Native American, and I'm definitely kind of like, well, as they term here, an alien. But the reality is, it's like, even now, having been here 25 years, you start chatting with folks and they start talking about, what they did, when they went through high school. And it's like, that's a whole life experience that I never went through. It's like, I've got 3 daughters, one of whom is just finished university. The other, the middle one, sort of graduated high school this year, and it's interesting to watch them go through it all, because it's not what I experienced. I she went to school in the UK.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing those differences, like even just like that whole high school, letter jacket, all that kind of stuff, homecoming, spirit days. It's like the enthusiasm that exists within the American school system is pretty special. And I kind of think about my experience in school. Then it was fine, my experience in English school, but it's pretty dour, pretty boring, pretty grey, in contrast to the enthusiasm that American people have in American schools, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's been fascinating for me, again, being the father of 3 daughters, to sort of go through the sort of the journey with them, recognizing that I have kind of like at least 3 major points of separation. It's like, one, they're growing up as girls, not as a boy. Second, they're growing up in America. I grew up in the UK. And they're growing up as digital natives, where everything's online, everything's social media. And I grew up in the the late 60s, early 70s, where it's like, you're lucky if you got a magazine a month.
Your cell phone was your mum just yelling out the back door that your dinner's ready. That was the cell phone.
And again, so it's again, life's always sort of fascinating to me how it sort of goes in cycles, because you remember back in terms of perhaps how you felt your parents didn't understand you and you were growing up and it was different. And then I look at today and I'm like, man, it's like if I thought things were different between my dad growing up and me growing up, they're certainly different now.
Do you think it's more pronounced, that gap, or do you think that your parents felt the same with you when they were? Because I kind of think of technology and the way people think and the way that people talk to each other and things. Do you think that the use of technology has made that gap between what you did different, or do you think it's the same? It's just a different age. Does that make sense?
I think, it's a good question. And I think that technology certainly puts a different sort of lens on it. But I think that fundamentally it doesn't change in terms of, how we as individuals mature, right? So your sort of outlook on life when you're in your teens and your early 20s versus your outlook on life when you're in your 50s and your 60s and you've got a family. I mean, it just evolves anyway, and I think that's a constant. But I think that the change in kind of like culture and how technology influences life and just the sort of the general infrastructure of the world, I think that does evolve and certainly puts a different sort of focus on things.
Anyway, I feel like we could talk about, paint that we put on our walls, and we had an invitation conversation for 2 hours about that, but we've got to start talking about the hobby at some point. A few of the things that you've kind of done in the past, and you mentioned how you first started getting involved in the hobby as a job. You mentioned working for GW, but even before that, when did board games or RPGs or the tabletop hobby, like, how did that first come into your life? Was it a Christmas present? What did you first start doing?
No, I mean, my entry into the whole world of gaming sort of began where I think, it began for many sort of kids of the late 60s and the early 70s, which is I always had a fascination for kind of like military history. I made model kits, primarily Airfix, and I collected toy soldiers. And I, did my best to sort of paint those up and would, play out little sort of mock battles. And, when I was younger, in my sort of, sort of like 7, 8, 9, that would often involve using little flick fire cannons or rolling marbles or throwing a Lego brick or something. It was a kind of stand them up, knock them down type play. But I started to realize that, when you did that, it's like the paint would chip off, and that would just require me to have to go repaint things. And I've never been a keen figure painter. Neither am I a great figure painter. So I basically decided to come up with some rules. So I, drew out some pieces of card, and this was how far you could move. And if you were within a certain range, you could roll a dice and maybe knock someone over. And then my dad went to the library and he saw a book called The War Game by Charles Grant. And it looked like a book about playing games with toy soldiers. And he said, that's kind of what Steve does. So he brought me this book back from the library. And that was like a Pandora's box. It's like I opened that book and it's like, wait a minute. It's like, this is a thing. It's like, there are rules for playing with toy soldiers. And, Charles Grant's book was an instant fascination for me. I kind of took that out on reloan over and over and over again, and that
no one could ever borrow it ever again.
Yeah, that was hobby. I mean, and so quickly I sort of delved into the Napoleonics, which really became my my primary fashion, also passion. But close second to that was World War II, and it was primarily because when you look at what was available through Airfox toys and sold time, that was really what was there. So yes, I started building up my armies and developing my own sets of rules and exploring other books, and then ultimately my parents bought me a book again by Charles Grant called The Napoleonic War Game, which really cemented the Napoleonics as my favorite period. But what is fascinating about that book is, Charles Grant walks through a little bit of the history, a little bit of the insights into the organization of the various formations, talks about rate of fire, talks about Prussian musketry trials to figure out, the hit ratio at certain yardage, talks about the speed of evolution of movement and ground scale. And all of a sudden, it became very apparent to me that it's like, this is a process, right? This isn't just creating a game and having completely arbitrary rules. It's like there's an interpretation here, and in some way, albeit lightly, there's an attempt to create some level of simulation. And that really, opened my mind to, hey, I can design a racing car to go with my Matchbox toys. And I can, so it kind of made me realize that I can look at anything and turn it into a game, which I used to do with a passion when I was in my teens.
Nice. Do you think if you'd had started maybe in like the year 2000 or maybe 2010 or maybe 2020, do you think if you were that age in this era, do you think you obviously would have had the same level of creativity, but do you think it would have gone into board games or tabletop games, or do you think it might have gone into something else?
I don't know. I think I may have gone into sort of different forms of gaming. So obviously, when I was young, there really wasn't much in the way of sort of computer games or console games. I mean, there was the Atari. I remember when I was in my sort of early 20s, buying a Commodore 64 and being very excited about, all of the games that would sort of bring. But of course, computer gaming at that time was in its infancy. And so I do think that if I had been born later, I may have dabbled a little bit more with computer games and what have you. But that being said, when I look at what it is that I find most rewarding in games, and it's kind of core to a lot of my sort of philosophy around games, is I really enjoy the spectacle, right? So I was a war gamer and a tabletop sort of gamer before I became a board gamer. So I was already collecting soldiers and designing, tabletop war games and playing rule sets like, Charles Grant's The War Game and Featherstone, long before I dabbled with my first sort of Avalon Hill or Victory Game board game.
Yeah.
And before I started dabbling with Dungeons and Dragons and, RPGs. And the reality is, as I got into those other games, I sort of instinctively would look at them and say, how can I bring miniatures into this, right? How can I make dimensional? How can I make this more of a spectacle? Because, I remember getting 1776 by Victory Games, again, when I was fairly young, and enjoyed playing the game a lot. A friend of mine at school, we would sort of, sit there for an hour or two after school and sort of play it. But in my mind, it was like, this is cool, but it would be cooler if there were miniatures and if this board was bigger. And
why is that? Is it because of just the 3D nature of it? But if you had a token compared to a miniature, what do you think a miniature brings that you can't have with a token?
So I think the miniature tells more of a story, right? So and again, a lot of people, sort of, in more recent years or over the last, 10, 15 years, talk more about sort of immersion into an experience. And I think that at least on some level, immersing yourself into an experience is facilitated when the experience itself visually represents the narrative or the story or the setting of the game that you're playing. Mm-hmm. And that can be through great 2D art, and great cards and all the rest of it. But for me personally, dimensionality is also, just very appealing. Mm-hmm. And again, you can look at how the execution of games has changed over the years, right? So, in the good old days with sort of Victory Games and SBI and Avalon Hill, if you look back at their early games, even the graphics on the board and the graphics on the cardboard chits and tokens was all very, very rudimentary. Mm-hmm. Whereas in modern gaming, even if the fundamental nature and format of the game is similar, for the most part, the tokens are larger, they're more illustrated, the cards are more illustrated, the game boards certainly have a higher level of illustration. There's a greater attempt to create an appealing aesthetic. The challenge with that is balancing the appeal of the aesthetic and making sure that it doesn't kind of, disrupt the ease with which you're reading the game information and the ease with which you can play the game. So,
you mentioned, just going back to what you said before about changing rule sets. So even from a very young age, you are creating rules, maybe changing rule sets. And you mentioned playing with some friends at school. So were you playing predominantly socially with other people, or was a lot of this happening solo?
No, it's nearly all playing with other people. So I had several friends at school who were sort of keen on tabletop gaming. I had a number of friends who, just like me, enjoyed collecting toy soldiers, making model tanks, and playing out a tabletop war game. Most of us were either subscribing to something like military modeling, which covered sort of kit making and model making in general, but also would have articles like tabletop teasers by Grant that would create a sort of like here's a war game scenario that you can play yourself. Mm-hmm. And then there were other magazines like Battle Magazine, which was much more focused on tabletop gaming with people like Tony Barth. So I had a number of friends who were interested. There was a sort of a broader number of friends who would like to dabble, right? They would come along to the odd game, but they weren't really in the business of collecting their own armies or sort of investing in the hobby themselves. And then as I got into my early 20s and started dabbling more with, I started role-playing as a player in my sort of late teens. And then kind of got the bug for being the dungeon master and kind of created my own world and adapted a number of different rule sets into my own sort of homebrew.
Can you remember, sorry to interject, can you remember how you first heard about role-playing games and how excited were you to do this for the first time?
Yeah, so I heard about role-playing sort of fairly early. I'm just sort of trying to think back. There was a guy who I knew who worked at Games Workshop, and there's a whole little sort of story there. But basically, I had a friend at school who knew a guy who worked at Games Workshop that kind of gave me access to, One Dowling Road and the Hammersmith store, and obviously all of the games that Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone were sort of bringing in, which included, the first edition of, the new Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and that kind of opened the door to there's role playing out there. And the guy who worked at Games Workshop had a little group, ran a little campaign, and I kind of got myself invited into that, and started playing, Dungeons and Dragons. And again, it was interesting because, the game was largely Dungeons and Dragons, but the dungeon master had kind of had his own kind of take on how he wanted to play the game. Mm-hmm. And that always sort of stuck with me, which is for me personally, I used to enjoy role playing that lent more into the role playing than playing the tactical kind of like skirmish combat. So when I ran my own game, I up front told my players, it's like, hey, this is more about role playing than it is tactical miniatures, and you're going to know half the rules, and the rest of it you're going to kind of find out as we go. Mm-hmm. I ran that campaign for quite some years. I don't really do much role playing anymore. It's sort of harder to fit into my schedule, but I certainly enjoyed role playing a lot in my 20s.
Did it go away, the hobby, as you kind of maybe left school and went on to either university or the world of work, or is it something that's always stuck with you as a child and a man?
It's always stuck with me, and it's just sort of evolved, right? So I tended to swing more away from role playing and more towards continued tabletop wargaming. Board games have always been a part of my repertoire, and it's interesting because what I have experienced, and something that I look at closely when I'm working on a game, is the question of how many play occasions can this game support? And what I mean by that is that you're not always in a position where you've got 5 hours and 5 other players, all of whom are versed in the game that you're about to play, right? Sometimes you've only got 30, 40 minutes and the players are sat around the table, so you need something that's a quick learn and a quick play. And again, when people talk about games, we tend to talk about games in the same way that we would talk generically about movies or a novel, but games come in many, many, many flavors and categories, and any given game occasion is somewhat unique depending on what you're playing and where you're playing it and how well versed the players are and who the players are. So when I look back on it, it's like most of my tabletop gaming right now tends to be more, what can I set up and play within an evening versus what can I plan to spend an entire Saturday playing? Because I don't have that kind of time availability anymore.
Mm-hmm. And when you transitioned from more RPG stuff from more tabletop games, you mentioned Napoleonics and World War II as your main focus, and as you went into RPG, that opened up that fantasy world. Was fantasy something that you were always interested in, but there wasn't really, you mentioned about only being able to pick up Airfix models. So was it really amazing when you picked up, something that was more fantasy based, or was fantasy new to you when you started doing RPGs?
So fantasy was something that I was definitely exposed to, just in terms of reading literature, movies, whatever it may be. So I definitely had a sort of an affinity with fantasy as a genre. Mm-hmm. I just hadn't played that many fantasy games. And so role-playing definitely sort of opened my mind to that. But what I really discovered, I think, with my early role-playing is just how much I enjoyed the discovery of an evolving narrative, right? And a narrative that I had some input into. And, that experience sort of never went away, and actually is something that I began to recognize more, even within some of the tabletop gaming that I did. So if you look at things like the tabletop teasers, that was a kind of a recurring article in military modeling. What was interesting about that is it wasn't your more traditional tabletop war game setup of like, well, here's the table, here's the forces for, Army A, here are the forces for Army B, everyone deploys according to these rules, and then basically we're going to duke it out until one side has prevailed. It would be more of, here are the rules for a dawn attack, right? So one army starts in the middle and they're all asleep, and the other army is going to come on from these different angles, but there would be random tables that you would roll that would change up and create different events. And it really appealed to me. Those type of tabletop war games were much more interesting because all of a sudden there was this bigger narrative than just you line up that side of the table and I line up this side of the table, and we'll duke it out.
See who wins. Yeah, there's more of a narrative to it, right? Yeah, that's cool. I really enjoy the books and the movies and stories or whatever, where you can potentially pick some individual threads out of the story instead of just a broad, large battle. Not that those aren't interesting, but the reason why these people are there and what they're doing in the situation, their desperate situation, something adds a lot of interest to it. So you mentioned bank. You worked in a bank. So when did the idea of doing something within the hobby industry first come about? Were you just sitting at your banker's desk and just having a bit of a cry because it was so soul destroying, or did you love banking?
No, so again, this is this has been my experience. So I always sort of offer it out to folks, which is you sometimes just need to follow your passions and do what you think you're gonna enjoy doing. So when I was working at the bank, I was working at the bank in Hammersmith, and about 700 yards down the road was one Dalling Road with Games Workshop. And because I had known this guy who worked at Games Workshop, when he left, an opportunity came up for me to work at the store at the weekends. Mm-hmm. So I would work at Games Workshop at the weekends. During my lunch break, I would often, run down the road and sort of like hang out with the folks at Games Workshop. And so Games Workshop was kind of, involved, and I didn't get paid a lot, but I got a good discount on buying games, so it was cool. And then the person who was the sort of like the full-time shop assistant at Games Workshop at the time left, and the guy who managed the store said, would you be interested in working at the game store, or a Games Workshop? And I said yes, which at the time was a horrific decision for my.
Was it straight away yes, or did you say let me take some time to think about it?
No, I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And again, you have to put things in the context of the times, which is that back in those days, working at a bank was considered job security for life, right? It's like nothing's going to change in banking. There's always going to be banks, and if you work in a bank, you do your banker's exams and you slowly go up the ladder, and that's it. You've got a career. Mm-hmm. So to give that up and to become essentially a shop assistant in a games shop, I think at the time my parents and other sort of friends and family were like, wow, that's a little bit of a sort of like at best a sideways move.
Did you get any stick for it, or were they supportive?
I think people were supportive, but I definitely knew that people in the back of their minds were like, oh, is that a good decision?
Yeah.
But as it turned out, and this is this is what I always sort of say to people, it's like, look, there's no guarantees. Mm-hmm. I could have stayed in the bank and gone nowhere, right? I could have left the bank and gone to work at Games Workshop, and that could have been a disaster. But as it turned out, and this is this is what I always sort of say to people, it's like, look, there's no guarantees. You could I could have stayed in the bank and gone nowhere, right? I could have left the bank and gone to work at Games Workshop, and that could have been a disaster. But as it turned out, as it turned out, I went to the store. I was very professional. I was very diligent. And within about 6 months, the store manager got promoted to go and manage another Games Workshop store. And he recommended that I take over. So all of a sudden, you know, I was actually reasonably young. And whilst I was still working in a game store, I was at least the manager of the game store. So, you know, that felt like a step up and maybe more of a career opportunity. And then as it happened, and I thoroughly enjoyed working at the game store. I mean, obviously, it put me in contact with a whole bunch of gamers. It created opportunities for me to run other tabletop games, you know, Warhammer, you know, battles, to also run some other, you know, and different role-playing groups out of, you know, some of the folks who came to the store. And then a little while later, again, through just sort of chance, there was a gentleman at Milton Bradley or Hasbro who was looking for some wooden playing pieces, and he saw Games Workshop in the telephone directory. And again, you know, back in the days, Yellow Pages and
Yellow Pages, yeah, man.
You know, and he saw Games Workshop, and without any other context, it just sounded like, oh, this must be like some little, you know, studio where they churn out chess pieces and checkers and, you know, so obviously I explained that, no, we're a hobby store and we do all these other kind of games. And long story short, we got chatting and he said, hey, you sound like you know a lot about games. Would you like to come in and help play test a few games?
Nice.
So, so I took 3 days off of Games Workshop and sat in a room at, Milton Bradley's offices in Richmond, which was actually very close to where I was living at the time. And they just brought in game after game, and I read the rules and I played them through a little bit and I wrote up what I thought. And at the end of 3 days, the then vice president of R&D said, you know, this is great. You know, would you like to come here and be a games designer?
Yeah, well, like, let's just pause that there. Like knowing what we know about what you've done, it's so interesting to hear that someone came to the shop with a presumption that was largely incorrect, and that was the opportunity that you then got to take up. That's amazing. It's amazing. It's really, really cool to know that it was a chance meeting. Would you say it's a chance meeting? You probably say it would. Yeah.
And again, I mean, you know, the guy basically phoned up the store. You know, the store was in Hammersmith. He was phoning from Richmond, and he sort of said, oh, you know, I'd like to see if you guys could help make some playing pieces. And I was like, we don't make anything. And, you know, I then explained that, you know, workshop didn't mean, you know, little studio. We were basically a game store. But this is what I come back to, which is, and again, it's, you know, it's not a sort of a strong life philosophy or anything, but I basically recommend to people whenever they ask, it's like, if you have a choice of following your passion and pursuing something that you have, you know, a drive for, or that you enjoy, however tangential it may be, the closer you can put yourself to doing that, the more opportunity may come your way, right? It's like if you want to be, you know, a player in a sports team, but you don't necessarily have the skills to be on the team, but you want to be involved in it. It's like taking any job to work with the team or be in the stadium or whatever, at least puts you in the environment where you are more exposed and you may profit from opportunities that arise.
Yeah, it's really good point, that, isn't it? People talk about, you know, working with young people myself. A lot of students talk about the future and the desire to be rich. And my response, and I didn't make this up, I think I probably got it from a movie or something else, but I was like, rich in what? And they kind of look at me with a confused face. I'm like, rich in what? You know, because there's lots of different ways that you can be rich. You can be rich in terms of finances. You can be rich in terms of job satisfaction. You can be rich in terms of family and friends. You know, so you're desiring to be rich, but what sort of richness would you like? So what you're kind of advocating for is a richness of purpose, a richness of satisfaction with doing things that you'd naturally be inclined to do if you were just left to your own devices, right?
Exactly, and I would build on that, because I think that there's also the question of, what do you want to sacrifice for that, right? Or what are you willing to forego for that? Because, when you look at, there's that sort of classic triangle, right? Which is, you want something fast, you want something cheap, you want something good. Mm-hmm. And the kind of like the simple construct is, you can kind of pick any two of those the way you want, but the third, to some extent, is then dictated by the other choices, right? Yeah. It's like, if I want something good and I want something fast, it's probably going to cost more than I would want to pay. Mm-hmm. If I want something cheap and I want it good, then I may just have to wait a long time to get it, because it's not a priority for whoever's doing it. Yeah. And the reality is that the things you want to pursue, it's not necessarily a simple 3-point construct. It's more complex than that. But invariably, to get something else has to be slowed down, deprioritized, or something that you give up on, right? It's like, you can't just say, hey, I want to be rich tomorrow and do nothing to get there. It's like that generally doesn't happen.
But it also goes back to your phone call conversation. If you weren't as positive or as open-minded or as polite as you are, that guy could have phoned up and he said, hey, can you help me make some pieces? You're like, no, sorry, see you later, mate, bye. But the fact that you took the time to explain, you took the time to assist, that probably opened the door, your demeanor, right?
Yeah, and again, I'm not the world's most sort of sociable person, right? I'm not the life and soul of the party, but I'm always very happy to chat to folks, and folks who know me know that invariably at some point the conversation's going to wheel around to games or history or something, because that's what I have a passion of talking about. So again, when that call came in, we very quickly ended up talking about, okay, so if it's not a workshop, what is it? It's like, oh, it's a game store. What kind of games? And that sort of opened up that whole conversation. Nice. But I also, to your point, particularly over the last few years when I've been running my own business, have really tried to sort of cultivate this attitude that it doesn't matter how well or how badly something works out. Everything yields some kind of benefit, right? Yeah. So even when I've had projects over the last few years that haven't necessarily reached fruition, or the game didn't get placed, or I always look back on it and say, well, this particular project challenged some of my 3D design skills, right? Or this project stretched me in trying to figure this out. So even though, the project was not the success I had hoped it had been, I learned something out of it. Yeah. I increased my skills. I gained some other, and oftentimes, particularly in creative work, there's something about what you did on something that never came to fruition that you can redeploy elsewhere.
Yeah, and that places us very much on the timeline that we're talking about, how the time that you'd spent as a kid with your Napoleonics and your World War II, making the game, reading the books from the library that you kind of checked out, doing the DMing with your RPG, and that positioned you so that when you went across to do the playtesting, you had that experience of stuff that you'd just been doing for fun anyway. You wouldn't have been able to just walk into that room if you hadn't have had that prior experience, right?
Exactly. And, again, I can't sort of put my finger on exactly when it was, but I'm also mindful of the fact that even when I was fairly young, whenever I was playing a game, I was always thinking about how I was enjoying the game. Mm-hmm. And again, I continue to be, even to these days. It's like, I enjoy playing a game. I don't necessarily enjoy I mean, obviously I enjoy winning, but I'm not really focused on the winning, right? What matters to me is, did I enjoy the game?
Yeah.
And so ironically, I remember being bought the Game of Life. I think I was probably around 9, and I played the game once, and then I pointed to the MB on the box, and I told my parents, don't ever buy me a game from me. And again, I'm deriding the Game of Life, right? I mean, but for me, for who I am, how I play, right? It was like, well, I spin the spinner and I move along the path and I do what it says. It's like it didn't resonate for me for the kinds of games that I enjoyed. And then, of course, the irony is I spent 25 years of my life working for that very same company. And
if your life was a movie, that's like a definite bit of foreshadowing, right?
Exactly. And on many occasions, did versions of the Game of Life and came to know the inventor of the Game of Life and appreciate him as an individual and appreciate what the game was for others versus the more selfish sort of view of it as a kid, which was, it's like I was looking at it through the lens of Stephen Baker, not through the lens of broader players. Yeah.
That's really cool. So can you remember the games that you play tested and the thoughts that you scribbled down in your jotter? Can you remember those, or are they gone with the sands of time?
Yeah, I don't remember all of the games in detail, but I remember there were a couple of them. One of them was a sort of like a stock market game, which, again, when you think back to the context of the times, in the 80s, with like loads of money, and Wall Street. It's just stock market game, was kind of more in the sort of like the general sort of pop culture consciousness. And what was interesting is it was using some polyhedral dice. It was using a D20, which in of itself was something that was novel to some of the folks that I was talking to at Milton Bradley, right? That they, for role players at the time, D4s, D8s, D10s, all that kind of stuff, that's all, everyone knew and accepted that. But back then, even simple things like different types of dice were not broadly known or understood, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that there was this D20 in there, was seen as something very, very novel. But one of the things that I sort of wrote up for them on that particular game, I remember, was, I kind of laid out how that fundamentally changed the randomness of how the stocks sort of changed through the course of the game. And that actually it would be more interesting if there was a mix of dice that would kind of even out the bell curve a little bit and would give you more of an opportunity to kind of bet with the probability versus bet on the extremes versus just rolling a d20. It was kind of it was too random.
And how were you approaching that? Would you say that that design or your design principles, obviously they've changed over time, but you say your design principles are rooted in it being a science or an art or a combination of both? Does it come from like qualitative, how you feel, or does it come from quantitative, stats and figures and chances?
So I would, for me personally, I lean more towards how I feel, right? And again, when I look at how when I look at the games business today, I have a whole bookcase behind me filled with games written about game design, game design theory, whether it's analog, whether it's digital, games that talk about flow theory, probability, games that talk about sunk cost theory and all so the science of how games are designed and the insights into how to sort of optimize them has grown immeasurably from when I first entered the industry and started, designing games in the first place. And the reality is that some games, oftentimes you're only going to play a game, a few times, right? There will be those games you play that are your favorites that you go back to time and time again. So particularly when you look at games that have got a little bit more sort of depth to them, you can pursue the probability and the science of the balance as much as you like. But if all of that is going to be randomized into some kind of context for the game that you end up playing, it doesn't really matter as much as, but as an individual, how did you connect with the game? How did the decisions feel? How did the game and how it evolves feel in terms of an evolving narrative? That matters much, much more than, can I go back and statistically prove that it was somehow bad?
It kind of links in. It's a tenuous link, I guess. But, if you think about like how science has evolved and developed just as a human species throughout time, we've been able to explain a number of different phenomenon through science. That's great in many ways. But I often think in a board game is that you want that experience and that narrative. So sometimes I don't want to necessarily know these mechanics or stats or probabilities past a certain point, because if it ends up that I get killed by a little green man that lives in the woods, I'm happy with that as a story, as a narrative, as opposed to I rolled a dice and I just happened to get that number and that's means why I died, if that kind of makes sense. And there's something about not looking behind the curtain so much, or not looking underneath the bonnet of the car so much, because it kind of steals away from the charm a little.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that, and again, this, excuse me, is a sort of a bit of a rabbit hole that we can sort of go down, but the way I look at it is, it's not really any dissimilar than many other forms of entertainment. And each form of entertainment delivers on multiple levels, right? So a game, there's the overarching construct of the game, there's the theme of the game, there's the implied objective and narrative of the game, there's the functional execution of the game, the mechanics, the rules, and then there's the practical management of the game, right? The tokens, the cards, the dice you have to roll, the cards, the drawing. Because sometimes you can have a really, really cool game, but it's a game where if you miss this step or you don't manage these components, you unwittingly unravel some of how the game works. So the simplest example of a game that is almost sort of infallible is Connect 4, right? Because you place a disc, I place a disc, we alternate until either one of us wins or the grid is filled. But either way, the game will come to an end. It's definitive. And the only way the game can be messed up is if you were to put two discs in a row and I didn't, right? Which is a fairly low chance of us messing up the game. Versus I can go to a much more complex game with many more steps in the turn sequence, where if we miss a turn sequence or we fail to do something, it can just collapse the game and perhaps undermine the whole experience. I remember many years ago playing Victory Games' Hell's Highway, which is sort of like one of those monster, sort of counter and map games that does Operation Market Garden. And one of the steps in there, and I'm only vaguely remembering because it's many years ago, but one of the steps in there is that, at the end of your turn, units that were suppressed by artillery fire in the previous phase get flipped back over, so they kind of recover. And we forgot to do that on one turn, which led to this whole debate about whether or not they should have been flipped or they weren't flipped, and it kind of just broke the whole game because we ended up spending 45 minutes trying to figure out whether or not First Airborne was going to get decimated because they never recovered from the previous turn's artillery suppression.
Yeah.
And of course, with First Airborne collapsing, it like undermines the whole game. So, so a simple example, right, of you want to design for the experience, and the experience is not the rules, it's not the components, it's not the goal of the game, it's everything. And the challenge is that everyone who comes to the table with a slightly different priority mix on what they're looking for them to be satisfied. And we all recognize that with friends and family that we play for or play with. We have the person who is absolutely all about the meticulous execution of the rules and wants to optimize every turn, because to them the thrill of playing a game is about maximizing each and every turn. You get some people who seek enjoyment from being the chaos factor in the game. They just want to do whatever they can to kind of disrupt how other people are playing. And you end up with the other people who really don't care who wins or lose. They just want to push some figures around the tabletop. So, everyone comes to the table with a slightly different need set. And part of being a game designer is trying to figure out what is the most likely common thread that will make this the most appealing to the broadest audience possible.
And I got another question on this, and it's amazingly interesting. I watched a video recently on the Beatles, the band The Beatles, and the craft of the Beatles, and it kind of was talking about this idea that they didn't listen to convention. They didn't follow the traditional tropes of creating music, writing music, performing music. They just kind of did what they wanted to do. And so you mentioned that you got a whole bunch of books about game theory and things. And do you think that constrains creativity? Do you think that makes games homogenous, like a group that they're all kind of the same? Or do you think that actually, the availability of those books and the theory kind of enables better games?
So I think it's a little bit of both, right? So to be honest, I mean, I will get, in fact, just this week, I got a new book on, how to design games. And, and it's the kind of book that, quite honestly, I read in about an hour and a half, because I don't need to read everything, right? I sort of flick through the whole book. And a lot of what is in the book is foundational, and I already know that. But what I'm really looking for is like, where's the nugget in this book? Where's the insight? Where's the observation that this person has that might challenge what I believe or might add to some of my own understanding? So I think all of these things add to the overall craft of game design. And I think particularly in today's world, the breadth of games to some extent has never been sort of wider. And what I mean by that is the types of games that are being designed for various groups of individuals. Back in the day, so again, if we step back to the 80s, the early 90s, the nature of the industry was, if you're going to design a game, you really design a game to be on brick and mortar shelf in one of the traditional high street stores, right? There wasn't a e-commerce business. There was no e-commerce. You could do a fanzine production, but that would literally be a very organic word of mouth kind of networking. There were a few games magazines that maybe you could advertise through. You could try selling to some of the small number of hobby stores that were in existence. But for the most part, if you were in the business of creating commercial games, you needed to design a game that could be on a Woolworths, or could be in an Argos catalog, or could be at a Walmart. And they only have so much shelf space. They only have so much catalog space. and they're only going to give that space over to whoever can drive the greatest volume of product. Contrast that with today's world, where you've got Kickstarter and various other crowdfunding platforms, you've got e-commerce, you've got a much more robust sort of infrastructure of publishers who have their own networks and communities and social media. It's just a very, very different world. So there is this opportunity that you can design fairly niche targeted products, either niche because of its theme or niche because it's a very crunchy, very, unforgiving, thoughtful, sort of game mechanic, for which there is absolutely an audience out there who love that type of game.
And you can reach them as opposed to the past where you maybe couldn't.
Exactly.
Nice. Well, that's an hour, Stephen, and I simply have to say that the table is set. The pieces are set out for us to begin talking about the games that you've created. And we haven't mentioned Heroquest at all. And that was one of the first games that you kind of got into and created. And I'd like to invite you onto the show in the future to kind of talk a lot more about that. But I must not take away from the conversation that we've had right now. It's been amazingly interesting. The depth of your wisdom and knowledge and understanding of this is amazing. And there's so many different nuggets of wisdom and insights and things like that, which is simply priceless. So thanks a lot for coming onto the show. We really do appreciate you giving up your time.
That's great, Dan. I've very much enjoyed chatting with you, and would happily, spend another hour over another coffee sometime. Talking about whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, and I must say this before we leave, but I hope that, I'm sure, and I do hope that you're aware of this, but I think I mentioned at the start of the show that I've recorded over 260 odd episodes now, and 255 I think that have been released. And as I speak to a wide variety of people from all different disciplines and all different levels of the tabletop industry and the RPG industry and video game industry and just fellow hobby nerds like myself, I'd probably say about 40% of them mention one of your games as their entry point into the hobby. So when you're talking about the Grant book and the Featherstone book as your entry, I really do hope that you're aware of your impact on the modern day tabletop and RPG and board game hobby, because you've really been fundamental in shaping people's hobby lives, mate, and it's been fantastic. I want, on behalf of all those people that I've spoken to that have mentioned in the shows that you're the entry point, I want to say a big thank you to you, mate. We really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for mentioning it, and again, just sort of in closing, it's always sort of deeply satisfying, and it makes me sort of humble in a way when I hear from folks, because I regularly get people reach out to me. They find my contact sort of somehow, or they reach out to me across social media and basically tell their story of how maybe Heroquest or Battle Masters or some other game was their sort of entry into the hobby, and how it led to other things, whether it's just a lifetime of playing games or whether it led them to want to design their own games. It's always very, very satisfying. And again, it goes back to my I sort of jokingly call myself the chief smile maker at a company. I am the only person, so but it's that sort of philosophy of like, what I've increasingly come to realize over time is what I enjoy about designing games is that it creates moments for people to enjoy. So I'm putting more smiles into the world than I take out of it. And we can talk about this more at another time, but even when I look back at Heroquest, Heroquest was really the culmination, albeit, my first sort of published game, that of everything we've talked about, right? It's got the dimensionality, it's got the theater, it's got the evolving story, it's got that sort of immersion. But most importantly, and it was very, very deliberate choice at the time, is that the center pages of the quest book were left blank with an invitation to say, design your own. Because what I've always enjoyed about games, I don't think I've ever played a game exactly the way it was intended to be played, right? Even when I was young, I would play a game and then I would decide, these are the things I want to change to make it better, or make it better for me.
Yeah.
So when I did HeroQuest, right from the outside, it's like it was always my goal. It's like, I want people to play this game, and then I want them to make it their own. I want them to add to it, because I knew from my own experience that when you start designing your own tabletop scenarios to go with the armies that you collected, when you start tinkering with the rules yourself because you want to make them cooler or better, or customize them for yourself or your friends, that's when you really get immersed.
And you own it. It's yours. It's not a game anymore. It's your game, right? There's an ownership.
Exactly.
Right. Well, we got to stop. You've got a busy day ahead of you, no doubt. I don't want to be bending your ear for time. But like I said, amazing. Just truly amazing. Just to have this opportunity to speak to you about your experience and things. And the biggest takeaway is that phone call. That phone call at the Games Workshop store, that's just a individual and unique and amazing story. It's so cool that happened, and it's so good that your journey, something else would have happened in the future, no doubt, but just the fact that it's just such an interesting little hook. It's amazing.
Exactly. That was the catalyst. That was the thing that put me on a different path.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, I'm not going to let you off the call until we've arranged a date to talk. But thanks a lot for your time, mate. We really appreciate it, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Beckons you over. Woo! There you go, episode 257, all wrapped up there. Come a little bit closer. Come a little bit closer. This is just for us, just for me and you. This is just for me and you. How's it going? You okay? You've had a good week. You're settled down. Finish your working week, hopefully. Ready for a nice weekend. What are you doing this weekend? You doing anything exciting? Doing anything interesting? Let me know. It'd be good to know. Hobby stuff. What have I been up to this last hobby week? I am still chewing through my rose nights, getting through those. Pretty much done. Just got a few finishing touches for those dastardly rose nights, and then they are going to be packed off away to their new home. I've also been painting some drowned men. I mentioned that last show that there's 3 guys on one big base of drowned men. So they are scantily clad, seaweed wearing, driftwood club sporting chaps who I don't know what they do. I don't know what they say. Looking at their kind of stats that I do try to avoid before painting, so that if they don't look like they've got very good stats, I kind of just put less effort into the painting. So I do try and avoid looking at stats before I paint them. But looking at the stats as I'm starting to finish them out, they don't look particularly great, to be honest, in the game. They're like worth 4 points. You get 3 guys, 4 wounds. Units tend to have 12 wounds, so these guys have got 4 wounds, so they're not very durable. They've got driftwood as weapons, so they're not really particularly good at fighting. They wear kelp, so they're not really very strong in terms of defense. But they got some perks. I think they generally boost and buff the units that are around them by, warbling or wailing, various different things that will inspire other Greyjoy units to greater feats in terms of pillaging and looting. But it'd be interesting to see if I use them a lot on the battlefield. That will be interesting or not. If you are a Song of Ice and Fire player and you play Greyjoys and you often put drowned men onto the table, then please let me know. But the box comes with 3 sets of them. 3 sets of them. So 1 set of 3 is 4 points. So it's 12 points for 3 sets of them. Generally speaking, units tend to be between 4 and 7 points. There are some 8-point units, but we'll see. We'll see what happens when they get to the tabletop. I think if I was a unit in A Song of Ice and Fire, I would definitely be as powerful as the drowned men. But I don't think I'd be as inspirational in terms of inspiring other people to greatness. I think I'd still be pretty terrible at attacking, pretty terrible at defending, not very durable. That would be my unit if I was a unit in A Song of Ice and Fire. But anyway, that's what I've been doing. I've also been painting up on the side. I've got another faction in A Song of Ice and Fire called Brotherhood Without Banners. then the Brotherhood Without Banners are probably like the Robin Hood unit or faction in A Song of Ice and Fire. So if you're not into Game of Thrones, don't worry about it, but it's generally like a motley crew of different people that find themselves together for their belief and their cause. You know, they believe that things happen and should happen in a certain way, or they just find themselves mixed up with this merry band. So I'm painting up one of their units, but intentionally I'm painting them up individually. So generally speaking, the unit comes with like 4 different sculpts. So they're readily assembled. They are already assembled, ready assembled, and you tend to get 4 sculpts. So I've taken one of the sculpts, which is 3 guys, and I'm painting just those 3 people up in that unit, and I'm painting each individual up in a very different way. So like different boot colors, different glove color, all that kind of stuff. Because I want them to have a real different feel, because it's like this motley band. So they look very different in their aesthetic anyway. I'm painting up like the Men at Arms. So if you're interested, check out Brotherhood Without Banners, Men at Arms, Song of Ice and Fire game, right? So they're intentionally got different aesthetics because they're just a band of people that just find themselves together. So different armor, different weapons, different stuff. So even within the same sculpt, I'm painting up the guys very differently, so that when they come together on the base, all 12 of them, I'm trying to get trying to get a decent amount of variation in them, even in the same sculpt, to kind of reflect the fact that they're different. So like different leather tone for the boots, or there's one guy that I painted, he's got actual different boots on. So he's got like a kind of grey boot, like black, but faded leather black. And then he's got a brown boot. So just to reflect this idea that, they live in the woods, they haven't got access to castles and barracks and blacksmiths and all that kind of stuff, right? So that'll be interesting. So I'm kind of using them as a palette cleanse also. So I'm kind of munching through my Rose Knights, munching through the kind of Drowned guys, which are like bigger unit, more coherent units. But I'm also got one of these sculpts from the Man at Arms to kind of go through, and that's pretty good. And I'm linking them with green and cream. Those are the kind of the colors that I'm choosing to link them together. So all of the guys will have green and cream as a sort of linking factor, that because that's the Brotherhood Without Banners colors really. But it's not going to be like official kind of colors. It's going to be more just whatever they find that's green, they'll put one of those on, and whatever they find that's cream, they'll put one of those on. So it's like that battlefield recognition, as opposed to like the pomp and ceremony of an official faction, which is the exact opposite to what I've done with my Baratheon. So the Baratheon force, I guess, is going to be very affluent, very rich, money is no object, so they are very uniform in nature. It's bright yellow, polished armor, all that kind of stuff. Like the Brotherhood Without Banners, I see as being the exact opposite to that, like a motley crew, motley band, not the soft metal band Motley Crue. Is Motley Crue soft metal? I don't think it is. I always get this glam rock, Motley Crue glam rock. If you like Motley Crue, tell me what sort of brand of rock they are. I would say it would be like soft rock or glam rock, but I might be completely wrong. It might be something that's a little bit harder. But anyway, so just to reflect this kind of Motley Crue band of brothers together for their kind of philosophical outlook on the Game of Thrones universe. But yeah, that's pretty good. And using it as a palette cleanse, I think it might be a good idea. So whenever I get bored of doing certain things, I can just pick up one of those guys and I'm painting them individually. So that's what I've been up to hobby-wise, but it's always interesting to know what you've been up to hobby-wise. Always really, really good to do that. There's been a whole bunch of stuff going down in the Discord chat, which has always been good. It's always interesting looking at the hobby progress and seeing what people have been doing. It's really, really cool. So Mr. Boondock Actual has been sharing quite a lot of pictures over the last few weeks, which is really good. A lot of American Civil War stuff, some fantasy stuff, some owlbears has been really good. So he's been kind of doing that, which is really good. Lars Gottlieb has also been sharing a lot of different things. He's been doing a lot of Blood Bowl miniatures recently, but he's also been sharing some kind of chivalric knight figures, which has been really cool. And what else? Smitty has been sharing some good stuff. Mr. Schmidt, he's been sharing some fantasy miniatures that he's been doing. He did like a kind of NPC dwarfy wizard type miner guy, which has been really cool. But I think I mentioned it in the show intro. If you're listening to this and you're still not part of the Paint All Needs Discord, I recommend that you do so, because mentioned it in passing in a few shows recently. The social media, for me, in my opinion, and I'm not poo-pooing social media, but social media for me is not me and my friends sharing the things that we are interested in anymore. It's more just like a bunch of shite that I don't really want to look at. And if I look at my blocked list on Blue Sky alone, it's huge, man, because it's just a whole bunch of stuff that I don't really want to see or don't really want to get involved in, and it's just a little bit depressing. So what I like about the Discord is that it's genuinely people that I care about, genuinely people that I want to connect with, sharing things that I find genuinely interesting with no advertisements, you know. So it's kind of what social media should be, and long may that continue. I hope that Discord does not get enshittified, or it goes through a process of enshittification, which is an official thing. Check that up. You know, I'm not saying I'm an expert in that sort of thing, but it's an official thing, so go and check that out. But anyway, that is enough of the post ramble. A little bit of a heads up for what's coming forward. It is mental health awareness next month in October. Coming up is about mental health awareness, and so I'm going to be putting together at least one show on life, I guess. I'm going to be speaking to Mark, who's been on the show previously, and me and Mark will have a podcast together, and I may potentially do another podcast in the future, about just life, really, and it's hard. I'm thinking about it now because I want to make sure that the tone is correct, and I want to make sure that it's helpful or interesting in some way. So I understand that talking about mental health and things that we go through is potentially delicate, but I have no problem sharing my experience with life, and I could just call it life. I think it's really important that mental health, if we say mental health, that sounds very, very serious, and it sounds I think it's maybe got a negative connotation because of how people have used that term, and it totally doesn't. So I'm trying, when I talk about mental health, I just say life, right? Because I think life is a challenge for our mental health, right? Naturally, whether you live now or whether you lived in the 1800s or the 1100s or whether you're a Neanderthal in a cave, I think life is challenging for our mental health due to its nature. So I'm going to do at least one episode on life and my experiences of life and how the hobby has personally helped me. I wouldn't say that it's like the only candle in the dark of my life, and it's the only kind of buoyancy aid in the ocean of terribleness that I cling to. It's not, but life has been testing and life has been trying. I've never felt the need to go to a medical professional to talk about my mental health and to receive guidance on that, but that doesn't say that I'm like amazing or anything like that. It's just I've never felt the need to, other than a lot of people have, and that's totally fine. You see the kind of twists and turns that you go through talking about mental health, but I'm more than willing to share my experiences of when life has been dark and when life has been light, and how the hobby has helped in both of those scenarios, and Mark is going to talk about that too. But the reason why I mention it is that if this is something that you're interested in, if this is something that you are passionate in, I'm more than willing to be willing to work together, or to give you the space, or to give you the platform, either through some written content or some video content or some recorded podcast content. I'm more than willing to work with people, because I think that the more of us that talk about our personal experiences in this stuff, and just being able to listen to different people that have gone through different things in their lives, I think it helps us to make sense of things, and it helps us to be validated in some ways, that it's not just us that's going through life. And I think we need to talk about that more, and we need to share that a little bit more, and we need to make sure that we are able to live our best life, because I don't know what you believe. I don't know what you think we're going to get reincarnated, or whether we're going to go to heaven, or we're going to get beamed up to some alien mothership. I don't really know. That's your job to figure out that stuff. But I do believe that I'm here now in this moment, and I'm very keen to make sure I make the most of these moments, because I don't want to waste my consciousness. I don't want to waste this gift, or waste this opportunity that I've been given to sit on this spherical object speeding through space at 1 trillion miles per hour and spinning around at the same time. So I don't want to waste this opportunity. So it's really important for me to learn about how to maximize these chances and be as happy as I possibly can in the time that I have, whatever time that is. But anyway, I don't want to over-egg that pudding, but basically the moral of that story is if this is something that you are interested in, something that you are passionate about, something that you feel you can contribute to, please give me a shout. Even if just like me, you just want to talk about your experiences, because I'm pretty sure that all of us are not just Mr. Happy from Happyville, Happy County, USA. I'm pretty sure that all of us have been through some testing, difficult and dark times. And if the hobby, or just you've worked your way through those dark times and you don't mind sharing those, and especially if the hobby has helped you through it, then you're the sort of person that we want to talk to. And I've been very apprehensive about reaching out to people as well. I've written like 3 different messages to people on the Discord server or people that I know about wanting to come on and do this, but I've not sent them because I don't want it to seem like, hey, you seem to be a sort of person that struggles with their mental health. Would you like to talk to me about it? So I wanted to do it in this way for the post ramblers, and it'd be much better if I can just approach you, or if I can just kind of like wave at you from across the room. If you want to walk across the room and give me a high five and talk about it, then that'd be much stronger than me approaching you. I don't want to offend any of you guys by approaching you. But anyway, that is enough of the post ramble. I hope that you are all having a great time. I hope that you guys are okay. Bear in mind that any noise that you hear in the background is intentional. The rustic nature of the podcast is an intent, and it's never going to be polished. It's never going to be studio quality for many, many reasons that I'm not going to go into there. But thank you for the feedback that people have sent over. There's been a few different people over the last couple of weeks that have mentioned that. And also be mindful of people's feelings too when you're giving feedback, because I'm a human being with a finite amount of time, a finite amount of skill, and you don't need to blow my candle out to make yours burn brighter. But anyway, that is enough of the post ramble. Until next time we're together, keep painting.